Mr. Stewart, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today. You mentioned our launch capabilities. Can you just describe to me what are our current launch capabilities in this country?
Currently, there is no launch capability that we have as sovereign as Canada, but there are programs and mission control launch in Halifax that's actually starting a launch capability, and another that I'm aware of. So right now, there's no launch capability, but two that are in progress to actually launch, I think, in the short term.
Okay. I've been talking to some other people in the space industry this week, and forgive me, I'm new to the topic, but we talked a little bit about National Space Council and its makeup. I'm wondering about, there was some concern with the makeup of the council and how that council can get things done. And I just wonder if you may be able to shed some light on the makeup of the council and its ability to work within the mandate that it's got.
Start and I'll give my comments.
Sure. I mean, we think the announcement of the council is excellent, amazing news. It's critical from industrial perspective that the Canadian government take a whole-of-government approach to space. There are so many elements that are interlinked across government departments that we're going to get the most effective use of industry with the National Council if it's functioning properly. On that note, we definitely think that this is important enough to be chaired at the ministerial level and to have at least semi-annual, if not quarterly meetings. And from our perspective, it would be great to have that centralized somewhere like the Privy Council office to ensure that it has the mandate to kind of oversee space from an entire government perspective.
Does it have like an economic lens that it looks through so that private companies can, earn their return on capital and continue to invest?
Well, we were actually having a discussion before the council started that there's such a critical benefit when you look at the idea of increasing defense spending. That can be done with space assets that, when they're not being used explicitly for a military application or defense application, can be used to support the common good of all Canadians, monitoring our coastlines, our fisheries, our forest fires, things like that. And that can be done through intelligent procurement, and that does provide a commercial benefit to Canadian industry and grows our industrial base, but also achieves the mandate of national defense.
I would imagine most of the space assets and the satellites that go up do need to have a dual purpose, because they're from a financial standpoint and the capacity of the computing power that might be up there is such that it lends itself to the greater good of Canadians, not just the military.
I think that's the opportunity. The power and what's being launched today is definitely got capability to do exactly what you just said, dual use, and I think be economically feasible from a government perspective, but also, as my counterpart has said, have dual use capability both in defense and commercial applications.
Does that help speed along? We talked about procurement just briefly. Does that help speed things along? Because again, private enterprise has a different time horizon than a government might, and a different efficiency in procurement. So do you find that if there is an overlap of desire of efficiencies that it helps to get things done more quickly, or does it leave the defense capabilities behind in that case?
Well, what I think is if the Canadian government is explicit about its long-term plans, then private industry can plan around that. And so they can build the capacity, the services that are required, and if they can then sell those to the government, as well as to other customers, with the government as an anchor customer, then that becomes a sustainable model, rather than the government always needing to procure, buy, and own its own asset, which is what drives the really long procurement cycles.
Do you find that procurement cycle, because it's so lengthy here, that you're more likely to sell to other countries as an anchor client, and then the IP gets lost from Canada and all the associated downstream effects or positive effects that we might have had get lost?
From my viewpoint, a lot of the programs that have been identified, both in NORAD modernization, those are all the right programs. I don't think it's a matter if you don't have the right programs. It's a matter, as you said, just getting those in place. There's companies investing billions in launching LEO satellites, MEO satellites. To your point, to be commercially viable, they need to find those first anchor customers. And what we're hoping is that as Canadian industry, our first anchor customers is Canadian government.
How do you protect Canadian civilians? We talked about AI in the satellites, and for a military application, there's certain things that we want to get out of that that may not be, the public may not be comfortable with. How would you go about, protecting the public, communicating that no, don't worry, the satellite is for military application. We're not spying on you. We're not targeting you. How can you square that away?
We're launching this AI mission Q2 next year, and the big thing to note is that there's very specific applications of this deep learning. They do one very specific thing. This is not a large learning language model like ChatGPT. It can't be repurposed to do something else. It's only going to go up and do the thing it's going to do. It's going to do that thing better than another implementation of software. And by demonstrating it, we can then prove that. And I think the other thing I would say is, with the Canadian safeguards in place, we can make sure that the public is protected and safe. If it's not a Canadian capability, then the Canadian government, Canadian people have no control over it.
The other question that I was thinking about with relation to that, if you have a dual-purpose space asset, are you not then exposing yourself to certain risks because you're now, with a military asset that our adversaries may find, a worthy target?
I think if we can design in, and this is why I think the Space Council is so important, if we can design in basically the requirement with, as you said, both in protecting civilian and defense use cases, it can be done right from the onset. It's hard to do once these things get launched. So I think the key thing is to get that in there now, look at those dual use opportunities, speed up these programs, and then make sure that as industry we hold ourselves accountable to ensure that they cannot be hacked with regard to satellite capability.
Mr. Stewart, Ms. Lapointe, 6 minutes.
It's my understanding that in July, the Canadian Defence Review magazine named you Defence Executive of the Year. So congratulations on that recognition. In your interview with the Canadian Defence Review, you said that we can't take our democracy's continued existence for granted. And you highlighted the need to invest in our ability to support global reaction forces, whether it be with respect to climate change or hostile adversaries. Can you expand on these global reaction forces and how space defense capabilities may or may not be affected by these issues?
Great question. I think to me, historically when we've talked about defense, we've talked about maritime, land, sea, air capability. I was in Norway not long ago, the Joint Warfare Center. Cascalion, we're now training NATO. I was at Latvia recently. The clear message for all of us is you have to look at both space and cyber as the new domains in the context of air, land, sea, space, cyber. So from my viewpoint, what I was trying to refer to there was that the problem is only getting more complex in the context of the pace of innovation across all of those domains. And when you look now at a war or war fighting, you've got to address all of those domains to actually be capable. So what I was trying to address there is that it's all of them. It's not just any one specific thing. It's all those things need to be considered now as you look at a space policy and a defense policy.
What is your advice around what emerging threats in the space domain do you believe Canada should prioritize? How prepared are we to counter challenges such as anti-satellite weapons or space debris that could impact both military and civilian operations?
Perspective, you want to jump in? I think this is where we have to I think this is where we have to be talking to our allies with regard to how do we collectively, whether it's NATO, NORAD, build those capabilities in. I don't think it's the Canada-only solution. I think national defense is well positioned to work with its allies in the context of how do we now plan the next generation of defense with regard to satellite and operations. I think those discussions are happening. Again, my worry is just on the pace that these are happening. And I think, again, working with our allies on a joint approach, I think is going to be critical to address that question.
I would just add that the technological capabilities that enable a lot of things related to this, if you're going to go up and service a satellite, the technologies for that could also be used to dismantle a satellite, to take a satellite, move its orbit, or somehow damage it. Those technologies are by and large very much on the cutting edge, and they're being developed by startup companies. And that startup ecosystem, we therefore want that to be domestic so that we can have that sovereign capability, at least certain elements, not to say that we don't work with our partners as Mr. Ford mentioned, but we do want to make sure that the technologies that are being advanced are not only being done in Silicon Valley and other places around the world, but they're also being done here in Canada.
In your opening statement, Mr. Reid, you indicated that the space sector is rapidly growing and that the competitive domain with technology development for space applications is advancing exponentially, including with AI. And your company's Spacefarer AI platform is a driver of the Innovative Persistence mission. And one of the things you talked about in the launch of that project was proving that AI can be trustworthy and can be used in all sorts of upcoming applications. Can you expand on that notion, especially as it pertains to Canada's national security?
I mean, I mentioned earlier about the specificity of the kind of algorithms we're talking about. So this isn't the kind of technology that could be adapted to do something else. So there's not that kind of big downside risk that we hear in the media talking about AI, taking over, so to speak. Rather, it's the idea that with more and more activity going on in space, and space being inherently a difficult place to operate, there's long latency for communication signals, there's limited bandwidth in communication, limited processing power. Therefore, the more intelligence that you can put on a spacecraft, the more things you can do. And so we're talking about commercial space stations taking over from the International Space Station. How are you going to build those with robotics? Are they going to be automated? They probably have to be. So they're, again, huge opportunity for Canadian firms. And we need to make sure that they are staying here, that they're in Canada to take advantage of that opportunity.
And Mr. Ford, very quickly, your company has expanded to some NATO nations in Europe, and I would expect the most pressing regional issue in Eastern Europe is Russia's war in Ukraine. Are there space technologies in use against Ukraine that we should be concerned with? And can privately owned and deployed technologies present a grave risk to global security?
I think we have to be cognizant that in that dual-use mindset that there is commercial space capability that can be used both in the positive and negative sense in the context of Ukraine or any area. Space-based surveillance clearly is critical. We've now hear people talking about weaponizing space, which is something we cannot take for granted. We have to look at a strategy to deal with that. So from my viewpoint, again, when I'm talking with NATO, when I'm in the different countries, everyone is frankly trying to address what does the next generation of space look like. I think Canada has a unique role to be part of be at that table for sure, and offering the capability that we've got, because we uniquely are positioned with our manufacturing and engineering capability here in Canada to play the lead role in this as we decide on the next generation of space. So all this to say is absolutely it's relevant. I think Canada has a unique place in that at that table, and I think we just need to make sure we rise to that challenge. Thank you.
Monsieur Sauvé, 6 minutes. Bienvenue au commentaire.
Mr. Sauvé, 6 minutes. Welcome to the committee. Good morning, Mr. Ford. You'll maybe excuse me for the amateurish aspects of my questions, my first time at this committee. So I will be talking about the intersection between economic development and national defense. So could you tell me a bit about your business? I think you said that you have facilities at Vaudreuil-Dorion. Could you talk about the number of employees, the impacts, economic aspects of your businesses in that sector?
In Quebec and Vaudreuil specifically, if I understand the question. Right now, that unit is actually developing a lot of the work that we're doing with NASA with regard to deep space exploration. We've done antennas there. If you ever drive by there, we have a 12-meter full-motion antenna by the highway. Right now, it employs about 40 people, and I see great opportunity for that to expand as we look at some of the bid pipeline we have right now for new space capabilities. So it's a key part of our supply chain within the context of space, and we're looking to grow that.
Est-ce que votre entreprise...
Does your business benefit from the ecosystem? Because we know that Montreal is a central place for aerospatial industry, not only in Montreal but in the world. Does the consolidation of this by public policies to the advantage of your business?
If you look at our presence in Quebec specifically, we have Vaudreuil, but we also have people in Saint-Hubert as well at the Canadian Space Agency. I would say we have not leveraged as a company, frankly, the local ecosystem. We've been pretty independent, and we're looking at how we do that as we grow. So right now, we're getting the support that we need, but more importantly, the key element of that is, Mr. Reid mentioned, is access to innovation dollars and continuing to grow our presence there with mandates, ideally from the Canadian government, to develop new space capability out of Quebec.
Dites-moi, Monsieur Ford...
Could you tell me, Mr. Ford, on May 6th of this year, Mr. Greenlee of the MDA Space Business said this, I'm quoting, Canada has accumulated delays in terms of the capacities of spatial military activities, knowing that by 2040, the portion of your industry in the global economy could be up to 1,000 billion. You're not worried about this? Do you agree with Mr. Greenleaf?
The opportunity in space, if I understand your question properly, the opportunity in space is significant in the context of the space economy. It's both from the context of dual-use technologies, from a defense perspective, and organizations like MDA, Telsat, Calian are playing in that economy. So I would say that I believe that Mr. Greenlee is right in the context of his comments. As Calian, what I control is what we're dealing with at Calian. And I can tell you right now, we're excited by our space opportunity. We're excited by what we're seeing globally. And really what I'm hoping and why I wanted to be here today was just to echo in that our pace, working with government, we like to see that speed up so that we can actually make sure we're leading the charge and not following the world on this. And I think we have that, again, I think we have a unique opportunity there to do exactly that.
L'économie canadienne, et puis vous...
The Canadian economy, and you see the newspapers as I do, is suffering from a productivity problem. Do you consider your industry as being a new driver of economic productivity, a way of generating products, value-added products that can strengthen not only the economy of Canada and Quebec and our aerospace industry, but also to improve defense? If that's the case, and how can the government support you and improve the prosperity of your industry?
I want to reiterate that I absolutely believe that the space economy can be an economic driver in the context of Canada. I think it can be part, as we said earlier, that 2% of GDP with regard to defense. I think there's a unique opportunity there. I believe from a productivity perspective, I think we all face that as industry. How do you be more productive? We compete on a global stage, and I would be remiss in saying we've got everything figured out. We need to be more productive. We also need to look at the creation of STEM jobs. We need to look at all the industries that need that technical and engineering skills. So it can be better, but I think we are very good. I don't want in any way to indicate that I don't think we're ready to take on the global competition that we're up against. And for me, again, with the Space Council, what an opportunity to look at how to engage industry across the domains of government with regard to whether it's space, defense, civilian use cases, prioritize those and make sure that we're ready to step up to that challenge. And we are ready. And we just want to make sure we're aligned with you on those priorities. If we understand the priorities and the timing, we will be ready. And then we'll work with you on other programs and innovation, the whole kit to get there. But right now, we want to take a step back and say, make sure we're ready to have that discussion with you with a clear mandate on what it is that we need by when.
Colin? 20 seconds.
Rapidement, Monsieur Ford.
So, very briefly, Mr. Ford, how does your industry benefit from our integration at the continental level in terms of the defense value chains?
I think the more that we can integrate the value chains, as you said, as we can integrate the understanding of the role that space plays in those value chains. I would say that most Canadians, a lot of industry, we have to do a better job in saying what role space has in everything that we do every day, whether it's communications, satellite operations, coastal monitoring. So that's where, as Space Council, we want to be part of that discussion to make sure everyone understands the role space plays in the Canadian economy, as well as why it's so important to not take it for granted and continue to invest, not just for today, but for our future.
We're going to have to leave it there.
Thank you.
Madame Matheson, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses today for your appearance. I kind of want to build upon what was already asked, but put a bit of a different perspective on it, in that Mr. Stewart had been asking about some of those dual uses and the security issues around there. We know that the government moves fairly slowly, unfortunately, in comparison to something as quick-moving as AI and that technology. We've heard repeatedly about the waning international cooperation in terms of space domain. The United Nations, we're working on agreements around the protocols on the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. That's had trouble. We've talked about that speed of artificial intelligence, the potential security issues. And I wanted to ask, like, how is that all coming together? Do you believe that that we're making enough space, or no pun intended, making enough room for, those internationally recognized guardrails? But in addition, Mr. Reid, you spoke specifically about the limited technologies or the limited capacity of what your technology does, but is there government regulations placed upon the use of AI? What do you face in terms of that? Do we need to do better? That was a very big question. There was a lot there.
Yeah,
I apologize.
I think the topic of regulation is an important one, and I think it's not often that you would have folks, witnesses in industry, saying that we want government regulation. Here we go. But I think it is important that industry know how to operate in what is largely a new ecosystem, a new industry. We need to know, about liabilities. We need to know all sorts of different things. An example would be, we talked about the conflict, Russia's war in Ukraine. If there is a dual-use technology being used there, that may impact its ability. It may be a target, it may not be used. So how does that affect the civilian piece? Well, we need to understand what the laws are around that, the rules around that, right? And so similarly for AI, I would make the case that we need to be involved in AI in space in order to make sure that international norms are set with Canadian values, and that we can contribute to Five Eyes nations and our other partners around the world by having a seat at the table, and we can only do that by investing and by being part of the development.
But one would argue that the government has to put in regulations first before all of that technology drives it and it's out of control, no?
Yeah, I think in certain cases, absolutely. And there was a question from one of your committee colleagues earlier about launch in Canada. And we are the only Five Eye nation that doesn't have domestic launch capability. And now we're working on that. And so that's great, and we're going to get there. And I think similarly with AI, we need to understand, what regulation is missing, what regulation needs to be put in place. But I don't think that's okay, don't do anything, let's go off and do a study, and we'll tell you in 5 years. I think it needs to be looked at the speed of innovation, as I said earlier.
And are all of those, like those guardrails, are they being presented internationally in all of these other countries where Canada, like all the other countries where we are clearly behind? Are there good examples of where they've gone, where we need to go?
I'd have to get back to you. Yeah.
I think to me it's a great question, and it's always a challenge with innovation, because we'll talk about AI, and 2 years from now we'll be talking probably about something else, quantum. And I think to me it's, again, with the Space Council, I think there's a great opportunity for us to have a dialogue with government in the context of exactly what you just said, laying out that framework of how we move forward without pausing. The innovation element of it is a critical enabler, but to your point, we also have to go in eyes wide open with regard to policy. So I'm, as industry, and I know as the Space Council, we're also ready to sit down and talk to government about how we actually do this. The challenge is, as you said, the world is moving forward with this, and we just need to find out our role to your point.
One of the dangers that I see in terms of the commercialization of space is simply that there isn't as many dialogues as it need to happen in a larger humanitarian first capacity. We've certainly seen the dangers in terms of the United States, SpaceX, that monopolization. How do we ensure that we're not putting that profitability first beyond what humanity needs in terms of those peace building agreements that need to occur within that context of space?
Diverse and broad space industrial base is critical. Absolutely. I think if Canada were to find itself in a situation where one or two firms held an almost monopolistic, situation, that would be bad for innovation. It would be bad for taxpayer dollars, and it would hamper our ability to set the right guardrails and regulations in place.
Sorry. Okay. Mr. Ford, I'm a bit concerned in terms of what we've seen regarding Calian. The Canadian Armed Forces have just signed a contract valued at about $1 billion for healthcare. Calian takes about a 25% cut for every physician, healthcare provider salaried on that contract. What's occurring in terms of the profits that Calian now experiences with its contracts regarding space?
Say that, number one, I'm not sure where those numbers come from in the context of 25% cut. If you look at our actual consolidated results, that includes a bunch of, not just that health contract, that includes all of our innovation and technology and products that we sell globally, not just the Canadian government. So I don't necessarily support that comment. In the same spirit, the health contract, again, I was just in Kingston today before I got here. It's a critical component to help backstop some of the capacity challenges the military is having right now. And that's the role that we've been playing, whether it's in healthcare or training primarily. With regard to the second part of your question again, please.
Chance to repeat the question because she's way past her 6 minutes. Yeah. We're now going to go to the second round. I'm sure she'll come back to you on the second round of her questions. Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes.
How vulnerable are our satellites if they were to be hijacked or disabled by our adversaries via cyber attack?
If they were attacked or disabled, they wouldn't serve the purpose that they were sent to up there to do. And so what's vulnerable is the services that Canadians and the Canadian Armed Forces expect from them, take for granted from them.
So geopositioning, what sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, everything in space, GPS enables every bank transaction, absolutely. Those are not Canadian satellites. We leverage, satellites that were paid for and built by the American military to provide GPS for free to us that we then leverage. But all the satellites that Canada has built, RadarSat constellation mission, as our radar satellites provide, critical information for us in terms of monitoring our Earth and, climate change and forest fires and all sorts of different applications. With those go away, it's very difficult for us to see what's going on.
Happens if we're attacked? How vulnerable are Canadian satellites?
I think from a vulnerability perspective, I would say, like all industries, satellite, our communications infrastructure, power, any of the critical infrastructure, we have to look at it with the same light. We have to be doing assessments against the vulnerability, the capability for vulnerabilities, and looking at how we best position ourselves to protect ourselves against those vulnerabilities. I see this no different than we look at our 5G networks, our banking systems, our energy systems. And I think right now the challenge obviously with space is they're in space. So these things have to be designed and built in as we launch these new capabilities.
So how do we deal with these vulnerabilities? How would we defend our satellites from adversarial, spacefaring nations or non-state actors if they were to mount a cyber attack to deny the use of our satellite infrastructure?
I think that's working with organizations like Defense, National Defense, and Cyber with regard to building in capability as we design these satellites. It's something that we have to do proactively. The cyber, as you know, the cyber landscape continues to get more complicated as we start thinking about AI in cyber and quantum in cyber. So let's agree that this is a challenge that we need to basically be working on proactively with industry and government and national defense at the table, and our allies, frankly.
How confident are you with that our armed forces cyber defense infrastructure if an aggressive state or non-state actor were to target our satellites and the infrastructure that supports it?
I would prefer to let national defense answer that question, to be honest. I think they're in a better position because I'm not in the understanding of all the elements of what D&D is doing today to protect those satellites. So I think D&D is probably, if you have a position on that.
Yeah. No, I don't have a position. I would just add that part of the reason Mr. Ford and I wouldn't be in a position to answer that question is that we don't have, the top secret level clearance that we would need to understand all of what the threats are, which is part of the challenge on innovation, because our companies could potentially be providing solutions that could help mitigate against those threats. But we don't always know those threats because those threats are classified. We can't get that classification level until we're under contract with the Canadian government to provide something. But we can't get under contract to provide something with the Canadian government until we know what the threat, what we're going to develop to fix the threats. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario there. And so I don't think either of us can answer the threat level.
Okay, so you don't even know if you're confident in our defense infrastructure. Are there any capabilities aside from the threat of cyber attacks and anti-satellite weapons at their disposal to deny or disrupt the usage of our satellites? Are there any other things that I'm not mentioning?
Now, the ones you've talked about, both in cyber, I think any kind of taking over a satellite or taking out a satellite, which is also a challenge, I think we have to recognize that those are challenges and threats. I think building resilience into our networks like we do on the ground and we do in space is going to be critical to help counter that threat. Again, that's work, I think, working with government, with national defense, with our allies, and how to best do that. There's no easy answer to that question, for sure, but I'm confident with planning we can get there.
Has CSE ever established regular communications with your company or organization, warning you of any significant cyber threats or vulnerabilities?
Did you say?
Yes.
We are not, I'm not aware of us having direct communication with CSE on that today.
Do you have any communications, regular communications with any of the cybersecurity organizations within government? CSIS, for example.
We provide, as Calian, cyber services. So in that context, yes, we have discussions with government on cyber. In context of the use cases or anything that we're committed or on contract to do, there's discussions around the cyber requirement for that. So I think there's ongoing dialogue, but it's generally specific to a topic or either a contract that we have today.
Mr. Collins, 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses. Mr. Ford, I'll start with you. At the beginning of the study, I had asked witnesses about the politics of space in terms of the relationship between some of our commercial sector suppliers and those that we rely on. You've emphasized that our allies have integrated their commercial sector into their defense strategy. I think you've both touched on the whole issue of there's an increasing reliance on the private sector. There's tremendous benefits that come from that in terms of cost savings. There's the driving innovation, and so I think it's important that we have those partnerships with the private sector. If I look, though, at the issue of Mr. Musk and the politics of some of his positions that he has, whether it's related to Taiwan or whether it's related to Russia, some in the media, some in government positions, some in the U.S. A NASA administrator just called for an investigation into the claims that Mr. Musk has been regularly in contact with Mr. Putin since 2022. It's a sticky situation there, right? So the increasing reliance of government on the private sector, and when the private sector then has these political positions that may not jive with the government's, there's an issue. There's security issues there. Can I get your response on how governments, whether it's Canada or our allies, deal with an increasing reliance on the private sector, where the private sector entity may have different positions than we do from a security perspective or otherwise?
A great question. I think from my viewpoint, number one, I think it talks to the requirement to make sure we have a sovereign capability with regard to Canada, number one. Number two is that I think the parameters of that relationship have to be very well documented up front and understood going into this, so we can't get into something where you're talking a use case that you kind of, something has happened that you said we don't understand why this is happening. So that relationship with industry well documented up front with regard to how we're going to work together, not just today, for many years, is critical at the onset of the meeting, not 10 years into it, at the onset of that relationship. And I think with that, then regular governance around the relationship with regard to how things are being run are critical, so that there's a check-in with regard to what is being done, and are you aligned with regard to the service that you're getting per the instructions before for the agreement on the contract.
In terms of, I also forgot to mention that Mr. Bezos has been called out this past weekend for not providing an editorial opinion with as it relates to endorsing a candidate in the U.S. election, and some are claiming that it's tied to his space activity with Blue Origin and former President Trump. Can you comment on those sticky situations that exist as it relates to the politics of space?
I'm also not going to state a position about my political leanings in this room. I think it's, as Mr. Ford said, I think that there potentially are ways where we can build in, elements of a contract, requirements around control flow within an organization. So Mr. Musk seems to maintain a lot of control over, say, Starlink. I'm going to turn it off, turn it on. I think there's ways that if a Canadian company was providing a communications service or a robotic service or something else in space, and the government was procuring that as one of the customers, again, ideally as a service, I think there's ways that the contract can say, we have the ability to make these decisions, not you as an executive, not you as a board or an individual person. And I think, again, there are also differences between, Canadian publicly traded companies like Calian and Mr. Ford and SpaceX, right, where this is completely privately owned. don't know who the investors are and don't know what that control looks like. So I think I would certainly echo Mr. Ford's comment that it's a further argument to have domestic space capabilities. Otherwise, then we are also beholden to Mr. Musk if we want to launch Canadian satellites. We currently are, as he essentially has a monopoly. So let's find a Canadian rocket company that's going to launch from Canadian soil, the Canadian defense satellites, and at least step ourselves away from that question.
Great suggestion. Mr. Ford, very quickly, I think I have less than a minute. You've talked about procurement a number of times. We just went through a very exhausting procurement study. You've talked about some of the things our allies are doing to improve that situation. Anything to learn from them as it relates to procurement related to space?
Yeah, great question. I think for me, the key thing is, as a customer, if we can continue to work with the government on the requirement and what is it you're trying to accomplish, and then let us come and tell you how the best way to do that based on current innovation, based on looking ahead. I think for me, just having that opportunity to become a customer in the requirements, feeling the pressure, frankly, to have to define the solution. I think industry is more than capable to define the solution. I think what we need to do is work with you on what is the challenge we're trying to resolve, and then let us come back to you with ideas on how to do that. I think that by fundamentally, without taking the pressure on government to have to feel like they have to tell you how they're going to design the house, we can work with you to, once you actually have a clear statement of requirement, to speed up that process.
Monsieur Sauvé, 2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have 2.5 minutes. It's really too bad that we only have a few minutes to discuss, because as I listened to you, I had a lot of ideas. And earlier I was mentioning that the City of Montreal is a hub for the aerospace industry, but I also remembered that Montreal is a hub for AI. And so I would like to discuss with you for the 2 minutes that are left in terms of government participation on the development of strategy, development of the aerospace industry. How could the government develop an industrial strategy which would be to the advantage of both elements, the presence of aerospace industry and of AI, but also of the French character of the City of Montreal, which would maybe allow us to create closer partnerships with our European partners and their businesses. I would like both of you to comment on that.
This is the opportunity and why I'm excited to be here today. We have a moment right now. AI, the government's talked about their commitment to AI. Space, National Space Council. Aerospace, defense spending. I think there's a unique opportunity right now to work with industry in a consolidated fashion in looking at how do we best leverage this amazing country we live in and the skill set that exists across this country. I have people in Saskatoon, I have people in Ontario, I have people in Quebec. I am ready to basically invest in making sure that they're ready to go to help meet these challenges. So from my viewpoint, your question's a good one, and why I'm excited to be here. Because I think we have a unique opportunity because all of these things are coming at us at the same time. The Space Council, we're excited about if they can actually work on addressing this issue. How do we actually look at all of those things you said, AI, space, defense, and take a concrete step ahead in a consolidated fashion so as industry, we're not trying to ascertain what the priority of the day is.
Okay. 2.5 minutes, Madame Masson.
So I guess I have to pick up where I left off in terms of an explanation and whether or not you agree or whatever with the percentages. And if you wanted to put forward those numbers to the committee, that would be great in terms of those profit margins. I am concerned about how that relates to the space-related contracts that you now hold, and that was my secondary question. However, just to maybe work it into the 2.5 minutes that I have, we were talking about that monopolization of space and the separation from where government needs to go. Calian has often, we've heard within our outsourcing study here in this committee that there were a lot of programs that were designed specifically by Calian for the furtherance of outsourced programs, and there was a designing of their own. So in terms of that monopolization of one company, how do we further protect, or how does the Canadian government further protect against that monopolization, specifically as it exists, where we're constantly outsourcing to specific companies that are then writing their own contracts to further their own profit margins?
I would say that we do not write our own contracts to further our profit margins. We actually run many contracts, and we do that in the spirit of the contract that we're given. The procurement process is quite clear with regard to companies not participating in requirements that they're going to compete on later on, and we've actually backed out of many RFPs where we're not bidding because their team was involved with requirements. So the way this works right now, from our viewpoint, I think the system works in that contract. It does not allow the monopolization, and in the same spirit, it allows there are specific barriers in place that if you are working on the requirements, you are not allowed to actually bid on the follow-on piece. So we've not had that, from my viewpoint, we've not had that issue.
I may be ruled out of order. We'll see. It's just, I would argue, so the Liberal government announced a $144 million contract to expand health services to be responsive to women and gender diverse military personnel. And then 1 week after that budget, your company posted a call for applications for OBGYNs on the new Women's Initiative. And then you posted an application under job responsibilities, listing, review, update, rewrite the Canadian Forces Women Health Program. So just in response to your question, that I had asked for your response, that's where that comes from. I did want to ask another question
For your
about
question,
space.
that's it, 2.5 minutes. 5 minutes, Mr. Bazan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I welcome both our witnesses. Thanks for being here. Mr. Ford, you come with a unique perspective. You've got 14 years now at Calian, about 14 years in Department of National Defence and Materiel. With that perspective, and you're talking about the RFPs getting outdated too fast, how do we fix this? How do we make this work to, do things like NORAD modernization and put the Canadian mark in space from a national defense perspective?
To me, to be honest with you, private industry has a lot of the same issues. I don't think this is unique to government. There's always so much to get done and only so many resources and time to do it. So from my viewpoint, number one, just prioritizing what are those things that need to happen in some logical order here and prioritizing it. I think right now we've got to recognize that the capacity challenges, that there's only so much you can do in parallel. So what are the things we need to move forward to the front of the line, get focus on those, get those done, then move to the next wave, and then to the next wave, and to the next wave. I think right now as industry, we are ready to go with regard to having those discussions. We think we are cognizant that the Department of National Defence is under incredible pressure with regard to the reality of pace of operations, whether it's climate change, Ukraine. So for right now, I think from my viewpoint, if we can actually just look what's on the table, prioritize that first wave, get the right resources in behind it, and procurement and commitment to make dates with regard to what needs to get done by when, I think that's a starting point. Right now, there's just...
And where all the investments are and all the different projects and explorations that are taking place on different procurements, NORAD modernization, I think, would rise to the top of that, and making sure that those over-the-horizon radar systems are put in place, as well as the high Arctic over-the-horizon radar position. Now, you're saying the RFPs, by the time we release them, are already out of date. So do we employ AI to do, procurement and writing these RFPs, or what needs to change?
From my viewpoint, that if we look at NORAD, the modernization of the programs, again, with our allies in the U.S. specifically, I think sitting down again, looking at what are the initial capabilities that we need to get up sooner, I think that's a start. Again, the prioritization of that. Then the procurement process itself is how do we actually get that in place as soon as possible? That I know is not always easy because of the procurement rules, but
on your Canadian industry, and I know that maybe you're not based in the radar system itself, that there might be used in over-horizon radar, but what about commonalities? The U.S. is moving ahead. Canada seems to be lagging behind. What about off the shelf, or like this is very developmental, I guess, in a lot of cases, about making use of the same type of programs and infrastructure the U.S. is using.
I would say that there is, to your point, there are satellite networks being launched today that are opportunities. The government's made an investment in Lightspeed with Telsat. So I think looking at those opportunities of things that are already committed and how to, again, from a dual-use perspective, actually use those with regard to that versus creating something net new, looking at our allies with regard to what's in place, If the urgency is now, which I think it is, it's a matter of what can we use that is either up in space or about to be ready in space to handle some urgent operational requirements, and then longer term build in the other capabilities through additional launch capability, other new satellites that are going to be required longer term.
Looking at longer term, we look at, especially from the standpoint of what's important in Arctic sovereignty and protecting the threats that are coming at us over the top of the globe. What role can Canadian industry play in making sure that we have the right assets and infrastructure in space? Is it more low Earth orbit satellites? Is it more ground-based North Warning system? Is that going to be archaic within the next year or two, never mind today, as well as the complete amalgamation of various platforms, whether it's unmanned or not?
From an opportunity perspective, this is the opportunity because we have opportunity to create all of it. We have companies like Calian that can do a lot of the ground infrastructure, companies like MD and Telesat can build the pieces. You've got companies like Mr. Reed's company that can actually bring an AI component to it. So I think that's the opportunity, is all of it's relevant in Canadian industry construct. There's really nothing I don't think we can actually take on and build with the right framework and governance around that. Mr. Reed may want to comment on that with regard to the capability.
Well, just with, having an understanding of what the Canadian government, Canadian Armed Forces needs are in the longer term and having that stated, then industry can position themselves by going out as a startup. We can raise capital and say, look, we know the government needs this, so we're going to go raise that capital, we're going to build that capability, and then ideally find a way to sell it into the government where we're not waiting for an RFP in a very long time frame, but we are launching a capability and saying it's up there, and one of our many customers could then be the Canadian government procuring that particular service. In the case of my company, maybe it's an onboard AI that's telling you right now there's a dark ship. This is where it is, or this is where a forest fire, whatever the application is. Maybe we have other customers as well, maybe other government departments.
Unfortunately, I have to leave it there. I apologize again. Madame Lambropoulos.
Thank you, Chair.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Ford and Mr. Reed, for being with us today. I'm going to ask 2 questions, and each one is for each of you to answer. So we can start with Mr. Ford and then move on to Mr. Reed. In your view, how can the Government of Canada help promote Canadian companies outside of Canada? And what opportunities do you think are already there that we're missing out on when it comes to being able to promote you outside?
I would love to see the opportunity to have the government promote Canadian industry. The best way to do that is to buy the solutions here in Canada and then become advocates, become the customer that says we're not talking about concept. Here's the reality of what we've done for the Canadian government. So from my viewpoint, it's a matter of buying local and then looking at how do you help us on the global stage with regard to becoming that customer reference that so many customers look for to say that it's not just vaporware, it's actually something that's operational today.
I guess from my perspective, I think one of the many great things about Canada and our Canadian government is we do have a fair system, I believe, and that's awesome. But I think we sometimes maybe apply that broadly when we're thinking about international context. And so, in my opinion, the Canadian government can pick favorites in terms of picking Canada over foreign companies. And that's how they can support Canadian industry. And we see that in other nations where a nation will work with their domestic industry and they'll be going out to meetings. They'll be going to business development meetings and partnering with, helping them sell to other governments. And I find in Canada, we have a tendency, well, that's not fair to, we're picking a favorite here. But the thing is, if that Canadian company is the only Canadian company doing it, they're already maybe selling into the government, as Kevin said, Mr. Ford said, well then, why not then take a step further and go out and meet with other companies and say, hey, we can provide this to you. You're a partner, you're an ally, you need this capability as well. That would be really good. And I feel like we're not, from my perspective, I'm not really seeing that.
Okay. Follow-up question to that question. Have either of you been invited by NATO to one of their, I know they showcase sometimes some of the technologies that are being made in different countries. Have you been invited to those, and what was your experience if so?
From my viewpoint, we have been in contact with NATO for programs like the Diana program, the innovation program. Around the space specifically, I'd have to check. I don't think so yet. Right now, it's been more around more AI, some of the capabilities that are required in theater. So right now, no. We have had discussions with other organizations. European Space Agency is a customer for us today, for example. So we do have presence in that region in Marsat. A lot of the companies that are based out of that area, we have presence there as far as customers. But as far as NATO specifically, I don't think we've had detailed discussion yet on that topic.
Thank you. And my last question, would you say that the biggest barrier to getting contracts with the federal government is the lack of communication between industry and the government, or would you say there are other obstacles that are bigger, and which ones are those? And if they're not bigger, which other obstacles that you haven't already mentioned would you want to mention here today?
Could say would be intellectual property can be a pain point. And that can come in different ways, but we have experienced situations where we have contracts in place with the Canadian government, and there's various encumbrances placed on intellectual property, which make it hard for us to commercialize that further or even raise external investment because there's this encumbrance on the intellectual property. So that's also that's another consideration.
I don't think so. I think right now, I've been in government as well. I've been on both sides of the fence. I know how hard it is to write RFPs and get through the process. And I would say right now that I want to re-echo that the procurement should support a timely delivery of innovation. And I think we all have to collectively look at what role can we do and what role can industry do better in the context of that goal. I think it's critical. And right now, we've talked about this. I've been doing this a long time. We've been talking about this for 30, 40 years since I've been around defense. What are we doing to give us timely access to innovation? I think that is something we all have to keep talking with government and industry and how to find mechanisms to do exactly that. Thank you.
Both of you.
Thank you, Madame Lambropoulos. This has been a really good conversation, and I'm sorry to have to bring it to an end. But before I do, the U.S. Department of Defense occasionally takes a position in a company just because they want to see how the technology is going to develop. I'm given to understand that the Canadian Department of Defense cannot do the same thing. Do you think that's a problem?
That's how it would be interesting if government could take a more flexible and active kind of investment approach in critical technologies. They do, we've benefited from significant R&D funding through contributions, but I do feel like there are times where that could move more quickly, and it, the needs, the evolving and changing needs of the Canadian Forces could potentially be met by coming to industry and saying, hey, we need this and we need it right now, and working with them in a different way than, say, traditional procurement, right? It could be an equity investment. It could be something else where money is flowing and a capability is being developed and then subsequently provided to Canadian government, but without that long pole of procurement.
I think for me, obviously, from a publicly traded company, that's a challenge for us. But I do believe the spirit of that with regard to investing in innovation, investing in the Canadian companies that are here, we see, and it's not that there's no investment. There is investment in Canadian companies. There's between different programs. It's just now a matter of ensuring that that we can continue to compete against other nations that are continuing not only to invest, but picking up their pace of investment in areas such as space. So I want to reiterate that we are getting support from the government. We just need to continue to find those priorities and the pace of innovation with regard to how do we ensure we're there to meet the needs of the government for the future.
Thank you again, both of you. It's been a really interesting conversation. So with that, we will suspend and then re-impanel as soon as possible. So thank you again. Mayor, Mr. Stewart, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses that are here today. Is D&D in government procurement frustrating? Don't everyone laugh at once.
It's not as much as it's frustrating. Again, I'm talking from a company size of Galaxia, and we established about 5 years ago. It's just the method of procurements that are fairly outdated. So when we're looking at the similar type of procurement process down in the United States, they've got a very specific process in place to deal with new space companies that are outside of the norm of your procurement processes. So in that sense, I think we do need to modernize those processes to make sure we can respond to projects that are not necessarily taking 2 years to just go through in contracting phase. So an end-to-end project of 3 years from awarding until, for example, deploying into space could be faster.
I think that's something that's specific to software or space assets or, you know, I'm just thinking about in your industry, the replacement cycle, the evolution of the products must be so fast. Then we heard this on another committee earlier, that by the time you get something out the door, it may be redundant or it needs to be upgraded, et cetera, et cetera. Is that kind of, for you as a business, it kind of runs down into wasted time and energy if things can be speeded up from a 2-year process to a 1.5 years, say, even by that much?
I mean, again, talking from a company our size, time is of essence for us. So, like, it's very difficult for a company, a new space company, to just last about a year and have to go through a contracting phase for you to kind of keep your talents, your skills in place.
What kind of intelligence is it that you gather with your, I know you said your software nano satellites?
So we do manufacture the spacecrafts with software capabilities. Our spacecrafts are capable of autonomously scanning for any sort of anomalies. As I mentioned, we do have some applications in critical infrastructure, gas line monitorings and things like that. However, in defense, we have many in maritime, land-based, and air-based systems.
Specifically in a military application, can you give us an example?
For instance, we can look for over a vast area of land and look for any sort of construction that is happening over a continent.
Do you contract your services out to foreign nations?
Not now. Not
Okay.
yet.
Next question. What actually classifies as a nano satellite? What kind of size of vehicle are we talking about?
It's the standard of spacecrafts that are usually under 25 kilograms. It can go anywhere from 1 kilo to 25 kilo. It's just merely the size and weight of them classifies them as nanosats.
Launch on missions with other with other payload?
Usually, yes, because of their size, they usually are launched as a secondary payload on, let's say, Falcon 9 mission, and it's called a ride-share mission. So they go up as a ride-share mission.
Being launched from the United States at the moment, or
there are several launch vehicles that do that. A lot of our launches happens through SpaceX.
We talked earlier about having to have guardrails on our applications, like how we're thinking about military civilian applications for space assets. And I wanted to ask you this: if our adversaries like Russia and China have no guardrails, not the way we would have guardrails, would you think it would make sense for us to restrict our applications to put us at a disadvantage versus our adversaries?
That's a tough question. I mean, we also see that with their launch vehicle capabilities as well. The type of fuel that are being used, the type of reorbiting methods and protocols that are used. For example, for China, I would say there is less oversight on that, so it really hinders the progress once, you have these kind of guardrails in place. It does slow down the progress.
Do they have similar assets in space as what your company's producing?
I'm not aware of anything specific.
Okay, so your company's producing something truly unique?
No, I'm just not personally aware of that system existing.
Okay. Do you think that in space, the biggest risk that we have right now is space to ground, ground to space, or space to space, in terms of the risks that we have to our military or civilian spacecrafts?
On an offensive side, or on just kind of a passive risk?
Well, on offensive side.
On offensive side, I would say probably ground to space, space to space are the largest.
Mr. Pawlowski, 5 minutes, please.
I'm new to this committee, but it seems to me when we're talking about defense, and particularly with Arctic sovereignty, any way you slice it and dice it, it would seem that to protect the Arctic, given the vast size of our northern regions, that any sort of attempt to monitor our borders is going to involve a lot of use of satellites, from everything from monitoring to the weather to the communications. Everything seems to go through satellite. Mr. Kolaz, I believe, talked about cybersecurity, and in talking about what seemingly anti-satellite weaponry, which I gather some countries are developing, that we or you do not have and haven't, or have you been contemplating what, if anything, you can do in terms of protection from anti-satellite weapons? Because it would seem to me that our defense is very wrapped up in our satellite communications. What, if anything, can we do to ensure that we're not totally dependent on satellites, and the possibility that some other country, by taking out our satellites, could severely undermine all of our defenses, particularly in the north?
Would you like me to comment on that, or just?
Either or both of you. Go ahead, Arid, if you want to start.
Yeah, I think the risk of space assets being attacked cannot be negated. But one of the ways that we can kind of get ahead of that is launch responsive systems. So these are the systems, the type of satellites that are ready to be launched, and that is an ecosystem around it. So it's not just the spacecraft itself, it's the launch vehicle that is ready to be launched, it's the launch operation and CONOPS. So these are satellites can be up in orbit under a month or two at times, or even less than that. So I think one way that we can get ahead of that is have these launch responsive capabilities in place. So in case something happens, we have the mechanisms to be able to re-enter more spacecrafts and add more assets to that. So that's one thing I would add. I'll pass it back to Richard.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that is a correct statement, but what is the probability of somebody physically taking out a satellite? It is much less than somebody taking over a satellite electronically or disrupting the flow of information. We currently monitor the Arctic every minute by taking a look at images and signals from a vast array of satellites. The ability to remove all of those commercial satellites, which provides now probably over 80% of the surveillance and communications capability, is a huge challenge. Taking out certain satellites that provide strategic capability is a different thing. So it really is, what is the likelihood of an event occurring, and what is the impact of that event? So again, the activity that is going on today, which we witness across various nations, is that somebody is disrupting the flow of information. So not a hostile act of war, but enough to disrupt the economy. And economic defense is national defense. So it's a question of how does one manage that capability.
So I take it from what you're saying, there might be certain value in numbers in terms of satellites, that we've got enough satellites up there that taking out one or two or a handful of satellites wouldn't make us vulnerable, that there are enough other alternatives. Is that part of what our defense is?
It depends on what those satellites are doing. Certain satellites are very specific, detecting nuclear launches, issuing nuclear launch codes, not for us, but for our allies. Those are very, very specific. But if you take one of those out, we're in a totally different world. The loss of communications, navigation satellites, surveillance satellites that are up there right now, the numbers of them provides a redundant or a certain amount of capability in itself. Having a coalition, a vast amount of capability, is a defense mechanism in itself, as opposed to having one asset.
Is that what modern intelligence networks try to do, is to ascertain which satellites are doing what? So if they want to take out a satellite, they would know that? Is that something that espionage, counter-espionage nowadays does?
Yeah, well, I can't comment on what they do nowadays, but what I can say is that information can come from a vast amount of sources. Some satellites can specifically look for very specific signals, and those would be a high-value target. That is correct.
Thank you. I think you're reading a few too many espionage novels. Yeah. Mr. Sauvé will ask his questions in French. So prior to asking him can you make sure that you're able to receive the translation?
Correct.
Okay, Monsieur Sauvé, 5 minutes.
Mr. Sauvé, you have 5 minutes. Mr. Garagosli, I don't think I would surprise anyone here by mentioning that the issue of sovereignty is something that's of great interest to me. Not Quebec sovereignty, but actually Canadian sovereignty in this case. So you mentioned the need for a country to have launching bases for satellite systems. I would leave the questions in terms of national security to my colleagues from the official opposition. My concerns are more economic. In Quebec, we have areas that are needing to be revitalized on the economic development side. And I don't really know very much how if you want to build such a launch base, how much does it cost? How is that funded? How many jobs are created? And what are ideal sites where this can be built in Canada and preferably in Quebec?
Yeah, I mean, being from Nova Scotia, we have the Maritime Line Services as an example that is working to build that sort of capabilities in Nova Scotia. But what it boils down to is very simple. We're very lucky to have 3 coasts around our nation. And just imagine if we did not have that opportunity, if Canada was a landlocked nation, and how much burden that would cause for us in this day and age. So the way that space is moving forward, at some point we're probably moving to a position that rockets might even carry cargo around, let alone putting spacecrafts in orbit. So it is very important for us to have that sort of capabilities, not relying on other nations to get us into that medium, which is space. We do not have currently. As I mentioned, a lot of our launch capabilities right now relies on other nations, so either launching from US, there are companies launching out of India or out of Europe. So we do need to bring that back home. I cannot make any specific comments about other locations that exist. That's outside of my expertise when it comes to choosing launch locations. But it is a very kind of a tricky subject to be able to find those locations that you are able to build a spaceport. But yeah, as far as the capability goes, that's something we absolutely.
How many jobs would it generate for the operations of the place? And I imagine that the salaries are above the average salaries.
Being a spaceport is a very complex task, and you have people anywhere from underground firefighters and technicians all the way to engineers and flight operations teams. So this is again a very complex project. But as you can imagine, like I really draw the similarities to having a naval port in your city or in your province. So it will bring a lot of jobs, no matter where that system is. And if you have traveled to, let's say, Florida. If you've seen the spaceport there is an entire economy built around that. So that is something that is going to happen, but yeah.
D'avoir des installations portuaires.
So having port facilities, but not necessarily railway facilities. Well, maybe I'll move to the next question. Mr. Kolach, you mentioned the risks that there could be in terms of attacks on satellites. So I don't know a lot about this, and I'm not asking you for instructions for use. How do we defend these satellite things? We've all seen James Bond movies like GoldenEye. Are we worried about nuclear explosions that'll destroy all electromagnetic facilities? I would like to know what you have to say about this.
Yeah, again, there are people in our Defense Department that can comment on that. The act of physically, intentionally destroying a satellite, I believe, constitutes an act of war. So the likelihood of that event occurring and how it can be achieved is a fairly significant thing. So you can intentionally destroy a satellite. There are ways to do that. There are things like electromagnetic pulse that can damage satellites. And then there are the more subtle activities that can take place to disrupt your satellite, trying to alter its performance without you being aware of it. So, I mean, it's really a subject that, you know, is best discussed by people in the military. And then even then, a lot of those capabilities, I'm no longer in uniform, but a lot of those capabilities cannot be discussed publicly.
Mr. Sauvé. Madame Matheson, 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Garagosley, is that right? Okay. You you've come to us from the. There was a project that was funded by the Canadian Space Agency and developed by the Dalhousie Space Systems Lab, right? This was a specific project. Is there a way for the Canadian government to replicate this this lab-based system? How specific was this to Dalhousie? Is this something that we can fund into greater existence, I suppose, throughout our university system, so that we're investing in that education piece of what we saw from Dalhousie?
That was a purely Canadian Space Agency project. It was, at the time, it was called Canadian CubeSat Project, CCP, which now I think rolled into Cubics, I believe. And it's a CSA-funded project that goes out to universities. And Dalhousie University was one of the 15 universities that received that. Each province received one funding of that. And I cannot stress how important that project was to generating a lot of talents and engineering students specifically who graduated through that program, working on those kind of projects and came out with very strong backgrounds and started fielding into our current space. And I would say for Galaxia, almost 90% of our employees right now were the graduates who were part of that. And thanks to that project, they came out and having a very strong background in space.
Sorry, so this exists in other universities as well across Canada?
It exists, yes. So Dalhousie Space Systems Lab was just that organization. I actually started that when I was at Dalhousie. So it was just the name of the organization. But the project itself that really propelled that DSS was the Canadian CubeSat project, now called CubeSat.
Funding continuously now? Or?
I believe it still has funding, but again, it's honest, it cannot get enough funding.
All right, thank you so much. In terms of, I want to go back to what we had discussed in a previous panel. There was a conversation about, for SMEs within Canadian industry, the difficulty that they have in terms of like a chicken and the egg process of companies don't know what the Canadian government needs because they don't have security clearances, but they can't determine how they best serve the needs of the Canadian government without those security clearances and that. Can you talk about that from your company's perspective? And then I'll move to Mr. Colas to answer the same question.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the exact same things. It is a persistent issue, I would say, across the board for companies. Specifically, I'm talking about space. As I mentioned, new space companies are very good at inventing things because we have a very low overhead. We are very agile. We can build things very fast. But if you don't know what needs to happen, then you're just chasing nothing. And the second issue of that is, once you have these capabilities, you really need easy ways to be able to sell this to the Canadian government, to build a case that you can go international with it and make it an export product. And that doesn't exist right now, which again, the models of that already exist in U.S. For the DoD or even like with Space Force.
So how do they get around? And Sarah, I will go to you, Mr. Colas, for the other responses, but how does this also... So you said that the Americans, they get around this. So how do they do that?
I'm not saying they specifically get around it, but again, they have built a very specific mechanisms to work directly with SMEs as opposed to like Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed. So they've got their own kind of thing going on. But
they have specific security issues as well, right? Even maybe bigger, but they don't deal in the semantics that we do. Is that?
I would say so, but again, they have different mechanisms in place that is more fitted for SMEs than bigger corporations.
Sorry, Mr. Colas.
Sure. I mean, from our perspective, the reason I decided not to continue building satellites was to focus on developing applications that extract the intelligence from those satellites. So classified programs represent a small percentage of the overall space activity that goes on. The largest company or country in the United States does a lot of work in that area. But if you come from that domain, you actually sort of know the things that they are looking for, apart from something very specific. So you're looking for threat detection. You're looking for communications capability. So in our domain, which is focusing on developing applications using the assets, 80% of the capabilities that are available now are offered by commercial satellites. At one time, they would have been considered classified. So our focus is a little bit different. We are able to provide and develop capabilities because we know what's coming, what's up there, and satisfy a large portion of the capability. The reason that I launched those satellites was that the United States wanted an unclassified solution for tracking the ships, so that they could use their funding to develop the classified system. So by Canada developing an unclassified system, it took a lot of burden off of the classified assets that we would have had.
We're going to have to leave. We're going to have to leave the answer there. I'm sure Mr. Polyev can help out with some classifications. Ms. Gallant. Yes,
Posed to both of our witnesses.
You have 4 minutes.
To both of our witnesses, does your technology have an automatic mechanism to report anomalies and uninterrupted and that are potential threats to NORAD? So if your technology detects an anomaly, or maritime anomaly, for example, is there an automatic mechanism to send that directly to NORAD so it appears on their screen?
So from our capability at the moment, we are providing information. D&D is using our system right now. They are not, I do not believe, forwarding it on to NORAD, but it could very easily be done, basically just by giving them a password and logging into the system, detecting threats unclassified based on the pattern of life analytics of a vessel, for example, entering the Canadian EEZ.
Log in. NORAD would have to log in. There's no way for them not to have to just go surfing for one of these anomalies. You can't just.
No, this system is operating today. In fact, when the war with Ukraine started, and I listened to the Minister of National Defense said, we'd like to know where all of the Russian vessels are and what they're doing, and how many years it'll take us to do that. I directed my team to start providing that information immediately, free of charge, which we've been doing for the last 3 years to the Government of Canada, saying we have that information right now, and here are the vessels, and here are the threats. So that technology is available right now.
Able to detect these shadow vessels that are transporting Russian oil to buyers?
Yes, you can.
In an event that Canada were to be engaged in hostilities with a foreign actor, how can your product or service be of use to defend Canada and assist our armed forces to successfully perform their mission in combat, besides what you've already mentioned?
Yeah, well, the primary one is being able to detect vessels that are a risk or a threat. So whether those are vessels running an embargo, ships are using it today when they go to an operating area to identify a vessel that may be smuggling drugs, weapons, or people. So that pattern of life analytics that we are doing with our system today, using unclassified space assets, is in operation today. In fact, we've been deployed on Canadian warships operating in international operational capabilities, as well as to organizations ashore.
Being impacted by a cyber attack?
Sorry, have we been?
Yes, have you been impacted by it?
To date, we have not.
Okay, and these questions also apply to your company. Do you have a means of signaling automatically to NORAD or the Canadian Defence any anomalies that you detect?
The way that we are designing our spacecrafts and all the environment around it is very software driven in a sense. So that means we can take any sort of information and we can relay that into C3 command software. So it could be posted into that or any other platforms that our clients would use. So it is portable for sure.
If it were a notification, would it help to be automatic? Would it not
Yeah, it is
useful?
automatic. I'm just saying it's like the destination is just up to the client where it needs to go. So it can be implemented to, that automatic can be text message to your phone if you want to.
Okay, so they have, so the defense organizations would have to subscribe to that service in Oregon. Do they?
Currently?
Yes.
No.
Even the Canadian defense organization?
Yeah,
CAF doesn't utilize your capabilities?
not right now. Yeah.
Ms. Lalonde, 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to say thanks to both of you for being here. I'm going to try to summarize one thing that I would like to hear from you, and I hope you can give us some guidelines. We've talked a lot about space and, you know, what's in space, 80% commerce, a lot of, you know, commerce aspect versus defense component, dual use. And I think my colleague was making reference about international governance body. Like, how do we, are we too late? Like, Canada is, you know, championing many initiatives, yourself, industries, but I'm wondering on a larger scale, what can be the role of Canada in helping develop some international governance into the space component? Is it a NATO? Like, where would you see this in our role as Canadian?
I would say space by nature is a very peaceful environment, and Canadian Space Agency is doing a splendid job with that currently. President Lisa Campbell. So those are the conversations that the Canadian Space Agency is usually having with our counterparts in European Space Agency, with NASA and other nations. So we are having those conversations, and again, as especially with the G7 countries, so we are definitely within that. We are having those conversations, I would say.
Yeah, from my perspective, there are a number of policies that Canada has in place, privacy policies, AI policies, Remote Sensing Act policies. We comply with those as well as European policies related to artificial intelligence, the distribution of information, what kind of information. So what we see at the moment is Canada is active in those areas, that does provide the guide rails, the policy, and the privacy framework to ensure that the information is distributed in such a way that aligns with Canadian objectives.
So from my understanding, you wouldn't see a bigger international governance body that would help structure what, you know, our G7 partners and allies are doing overall into the space component.
So again, we focus on the intelligence derived from those space assets, and what we do see is there is a harmonization. There is nothing that is drastically different. There are elements that are slightly different, but we see that Canada is harmonized with the rest of the world in terms of developing those policies and regulations.
Okay, and I'm going to leave you both with anything that you could recommend to this committee that would help us develop some recommendation for the government. Mr. Kolak?
Well, again, given that we are an organization that derives intelligence from the assets that are up there, what I have found working with the Space Agency and the Defense Department is projects that allow us to demonstrate the validity of what we do are extremely useful. They're worth 10 times the amount of money we get. So we're developing new capabilities to manage vessels, for example, to support supply chain resilience and identify risks. And we've been funded under a number of different programs, Ocean Supercluster, SDTC, DRDC, IDEAS. So the ability to validate the technology, it was the same when we worked with the Space Agency. Every time they launched a satellite, there was room for a new technology. That is invaluable, and it gives us a competitive edge, actually, over some of the other people. We would all like to see more money, but the opportunity will be demonstrating the world's first air traffic control system for ships using satellite technology along the St. Lawrence Seaway from the North Atlantic approaches all the way into the Great Lakes. The ability to validate and show that capability to the rest of the world is hugely important to us, and we'd like to see those programs continuing.
Minute and a half, Monsieur Sauvé.
Monsieur Kolach.
Mr. Kolach, your company works in the maritime sector. We talked a lot about dual-use technologies in the study. There's something that is very dear to me. It's the fisheries. We have seen in the media the use of marine animals for espionage purposes by some countries. Can you explain how military technologies that are developed can also be used for other purposes, the protection of whales or other sea mammals?
Project with the Canadian Space Agency, where we use optical satellites to do facial recognition on the North Atlantic right whale, which is a protected species which sails off of the coast of the St. Lawrence. Why is that important? Because when you detect the North Atlantic right whale, your ship is supposed to slow down and move over. It's like having a moose on the road when you're driving from Montreal to Ottawa. You know, the impact on all of the other vehicles, which means that you can slow down your speed of your ship. You're going to save fuel, but more importantly, you're going to save emissions. Up to 200 million tons a year can be saved on emissions by using Google Maps for ships. That's an example of using an optical image. It's not a military capability, but it's a high resolution capability that can be used to support, you know, dual use systems. So we don't use any classified asset information, obviously, but it's an example of the type of technology that that can be used, and it's a major part. I should say that we've just moved our corporate headquarters to Montreal as well. Our development team is in Halifax, and we're working closely with the fantastic support that we have from the Quebec government in developing our AI capability and rolling out this to the rest of the world.
Mr. Sauvé, a minute and a half. Ms. Matheson.
I guess to continue to build off of what Madame Lalonde was talking about, just in terms of those international bodies and the understanding of what space has been, there is a great concern in terms of the weaponization of space, absolutely. I certainly am concerned about the commercialization of space. So as an academic, and conducting that research, can you talk about what the Canadian government needs to do through potentially those international bodies, whatever we set up, to protect that idea that space is peaceful, but to allow for the room to be provided for that academic research side of things?
Yeah, I mean, it's as I mentioned, we like it or not, there will be going to we will have some defense capabilities and operations happening in space, we like it or not. But the majority of that is on the commercial side. And what happens is a very small segment of that commercial side is dedicated to the academic sector. But again, I will kind of circle back to the very fact that space is expensive. So if we want to see innovation, we want to see growth in Canada, we do need to invest back into the academic section as well to make sure they've got enough funding and there is enough kind of research that goes around that can propel that sort of cutting-edge technologies we were talking about when it comes to quantum communication, when it comes to synthetic aperture radars and communication systems and things like that.
Mr. Bazan, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. On the nano satellites, what type of, like, you're miniaturizing everything, and definitely technology is advancing. What's the lifespan on a nano satellite, knowing that you're going to have a smaller battery and everything else that will limit life expectancy?
Most nano satellites can survive the low Earth orbit, which is about 500 to 600 kilometers. They can survive that for 3 to 4 years, usually less than that. And depends if the spacecraft comes back to Earth to deorbit. And if it stays up there, again, you're dealing with the very harsh environment of space, primarily the radiation environment. So 2 to 3 years is a fair assumption. However, the approach that we are having, and a lot of other new space companies are having to that, is the rate at which the technology is evolving here on Earth doesn't really justify us launching a satellite that is going to stay up there for 20 years. We are still doing that, But again, even with your phone, when you compare that to like 2 years ago, you can see it's much faster. You have better cameras and things like that. You have the exact same things in space. So if you can kind of reduce the cost of your spacecraft so you can kind of launch more frequently, have better capabilities more frequently, then some companies kind of have that approach.
BlackBerry's not going to work anymore?
We tried that. It didn't work.
They just stay up there then as space junk, or do you actually have them burn up in the atmosphere?
So we have a mandate of bringing those back, or at least have procedures and protocols in place to ensure that it will come back to not generate space junk. A lot of low Earth orbit spacecrafts do come back just because their relativity closer being to Earth, the gravity force is stronger on them. So they do come back over time, usually somewhere between 5 to 10 years. It could be a bit longer. Some spacecraft have forced deorbiting mechanisms in place that you can bring them back immediately. But a lot of newer missions, especially going out of US, Canada, Europe, they do have very robust plans in place to ensure we don't create more space junk.
So if you look at this from what our adversaries would do, how would they make use of a nanosatellite against Canada?
I would say it's a very similar situation. When it comes to nanosatellites, again, as the technology evolved, we can pack more technologies into smaller form factors. We can still detect a lot of these objects in low Earth orbit using Doppler radars or other type of SSAs that we have or our allies have. So again, the boundaries of space is really not there. So you can really go over any country you want. You can pretty much observe whatever you want. It's just kind of our responsibility to keep it clean and make sure we play safe.
Satellite being as small as it is, you can still pack on the optics that you need to do satellite surveillance, reconnaissance, and intelligence gathering.
I would say so.
Okay. Would you agree with that, Mr. Colas?
There are physical limitations on the aperture side. It's a physics, so the optical resolution or the radar resolution you can get diminished the smaller the aperture that you have. So you certainly can't get, sub-meter or multi-centimeter resolution. You can't pick up signals information. So there's a limitation. And of course, one way is simply by having a lot of them, you can overwhelm defenses, whatever those defense systems are, much like we see the use of drones in Ukraine and Russia at the moment. So there is a physical limitation to the aperture size that you can put on a small platform, which has a limitation, but you then can use those for detecting 80% of what you want to detect and use the very large aperture, larger satellites like RadarSat to be able to detect, much, much smaller devices.
If we're done.
Final question. How does my ship disappear from your system, Mr. Cults?
Well, you won't. What you will do, first of all, is you'll turn off your transponder, which sends a flag to us immediately to say you're doing something suspicious because you've turned off your transponder. So now we can task a radar satellite or an optical satellite or an unclassified RF SIGINT satellite to pick up any of the transmissions, look for you via radar, night or day through clouds, or optically. So you will never disappear.
Oh, that's a shame. That's also interesting. What if I'm a Russian submarine?
Well, you go under the water, and that's a different story.
And so, at some point, you would lose, but all submarines have to come up for air at one point or another.
Well, no. The nuclear submarines don't have to come up for air, but there are other things to look for that sort of go beyond this discussion.
So this is in some respects a foolproof system that at any point any government can find any ship in any place.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Thank you. Interesting discussion again for second hour. I really appreciate both of you sharing with us your information and knowledge. And colleagues, with that, we'll bring it to an end.